Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The historical irony here is that neither Japan nor the United States wanted to go to war with each other. The root cause for the attack at Pearl Harbor is not complicated. Since the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan embarked on an expansionist policy and built an empire. Well, I am oversimplifying here, as Japan had learned how to play the so-called great game of imperialism. As one Japanese diplomat in the early 20th century remarked while in England, "We used to be a nation of artists. You called us barbarians then, but now we have learned to kill, and you say we are civilized." The Second World War began with Japan's invasion of China in July 1937. The Japanese had hoped for a quick victory in territorial concessions and neither expected nor wanted a prolonged war. But China fought on. Despite numerous Japanese victories and a brutal occupation policy marked by the Rape of Nanking, China was too vast to conquer, and Japan's economy strained under the weight of such a vast commitment. Japanese policymakers soon found themselves in a quandary how to end what they called the China incident. Withdrawal was intolerable, and the United States, who was the primary supplier for the imports needed for Japan's economy, was opposed to its aggression. Germany's victories in Europe seemed to offer what the Japanese Minister of War stated was a golden opportunity. The oil, rubber, and resource-rich European colonies of Southeast Asia lay ripe for the taking. Such a course would potentially solve Japan's economic woes. However, it raised a different problem: the U.S. possession of the Philippines. The United States possessed a powerful navy that would easily be able to interdict Japan's connection to these resources and thus defeat the whole purpose of taking them. And so Japanese policymakers convinced themselves that a powerful first strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor would incapacitate it long enough to capture and secure those southern resources. So goes the traditional explanation. Digging a little deeper reveals something that may surprise. The Japanese had no intention of ever invading the United States or even necessarily defeating it in a prolonged war. They knew neither was possible because their industrial base was dwarfed by the proverbial sleeping giant that was the United States. Instead, they had hoped to avoid a protracted war. They reckoned a devastating first strike on the American Pacific Fleet would demonstrate that the U.S. would have to pay an unacceptably high price of blood in a total war against Japan, and thus would be obliged to come to some sort of compromise peace. Historian John Dower has shown this dubious assessment was rooted in Japanese racist assumptions about the character of the American population. Historical actors don't always behave rationally or in their best interest. Japan lacked the manpower, resources, and industry to militarily dictate terms to the United States. Instead, it put its hopes that some force beyond its control, such as German European hegemony or American decadence, would prove to be decisive. This goes beyond brinksmanship. The internal correspondence and discussion among Japanese policymakers reveal a strong element of fatalism in embellishing such self-deception and embarking on this course. There is no alternative but to take a resolute attitude. And we must reckon with and plan for war, for the survival of the empire, whether we like it or not. To be clear, Japan found itself peering into the abyss of a war it did not want to wage because of its aggressive expansionism in East Asia. The so-called China incident was the pivot. Politically, Japan could not extricate itself from it. Militarily, Japan could not force its opponent to surrender. And economically, Japan could not sustain it. Foreseeing eventual war or permanent subordination to the United States, Japan's policymakers opted for a preemptive strike and to wage a war it feared under what they felt were the most favorable conditions possible. And so, on November 26, 1941, the core striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the 6 carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soiru, Hiru, Zoikaku, and Shokoku, with their complement of 440 aircraft, steamed from the Kuril Islands toward Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet who planned the operation, intended for the attack to occur 30 minutes after a formal declaration of war. In the event, such fine timing was overambitious, and the diplomatic message, which more implied war than officially declared it, was not delivered until after the attack. It was an episode that reveals the overall disconnect between Japanese military and diplomatic officials, as well as an over-reliance on everything falling into place precisely as planned. The Japanese plan was predicated on surprise, another uncontrollable variable, and they were lucky to have achieved it. An unnecessary complication was the inclusion of 5 submarines. There was no possible way to coordinate the timing, and since the subs had to navigate waters patrolled by U.S. ships, they threatened to expose the secrecy of the entire operation before the Japanese aviators even arrived. As it happens, an alert U.S. destroyer, the USS Ward, spotted one of the subs, and in the first shots fired in the Pacific War, sunk what it reported as a submarine operating in defensive sea areas at 6:45 a.m., more than an hour before the first Japanese bombs were dropped. In another episode, U.S. radar operators detected the incoming Japanese aircraft at 7:02 a.m., but it was Sunday morning, and the untrained officer on duty told them not to worry because an incoming flight of U.S. B-17s was expected. Complacency, incompetence, coincidence, and just dumb luck often play critical roles in history that are difficult to quantify. Though perhaps what is at play here is that real-time processing of a surprise attack is at its nature difficult to comprehend. Indeed, it ought to be remembered that the Soviet Union was similarly the victim of a devastating surprise attack by an obvious potential enemy it also had excellent intelligence on. At 7:53 local time on that lazy Sunday morning, Lieutenant Commander Fuchida signaled Tora, Tora, Tora to indicate that complete surprise had been achieved. There was no prepared defense, no U.S. planes patrolled the sky, and most of the U.S. servicemen were in their morning routines. On the USS Nevada, for example, the ship's band was playing the Star-Spangled Banner as the first bombs fell. Band leader Odin McMillan and the band played on, albeit at a much quicker tempo, until the anthem was complete before breaking for cover. The primary targets of the attack were the battleships moored in what was called Battleship Row. By fluke of geography, the Oklahoma and West Virginia bore the brunt of the torpedo attack. Torpedo planes have to fly low and slow and stable. That compelled the Japanese Kate bombers to fly down in a drawn-out single-file formation over the southeast lock that lined up perpendicular to the Oklahoma and West Virginia. Those 2 unlucky ships accounted for more than half of the Japanese torpedo attacks against Battleship Row. Oklahoma was hit by 5 torpedoes and quickly capsized. West Virginia was hit by a staggering 7, but skillful damage control prevented it from suffering the same fate. In this extraordinary photo of the opening phase of the attack, 2 Japanese planes can be seen here. In this top-down view of Battleship Row taken moments later, we can see the damage from the torpedo attack. Oil is gushing from the stricken ships, and Oklahoma is listing badly to port. The next group of attackers were high-level bombers, whose primary responsibility was to hit the interior ships that were shielded from torpedoes. They achieved some minor hits, However, this group was relatively ineffective save one lucky bomb. The USS Arizona was to become a spectacular example of how chance and contingency can dictate the unfolding of history. At 8:06, a single bomb pierced the armored deck of the Arizona and detonated the ship's ammunition magazine, causing a catastrophic explosion which effectively tore the ship in half. 1,177 of the serving 1,500 sailors were killed, representing about half the lives lost during the whole Pearl Harbor attack. The Japanese had also dedicated 50 attack bombers to neutralize the U.S. airfields in order to ensure they maintained air supremacy. The U.S. Army commander, General Walter Short's dubious decision to neatly park the American planes together to guard against sabotage made them prime targets for Japanese bombs and strafing Zeros. Nearly 200 U.S. planes were totally destroyed and over 150 were damaged, the vast majority while still on the ground. Only a handful of U.S. planes got airborne due solely to the initiative and bravery of the pilots. Lieutenants Kenneth Taylor and George Welch, donned in their tuxedo pants, took off without orders and proceeded to attack despite being ridiculously outnumbered. How things could have gone differently if the U.S. planes were not destroyed on the ground is suggested that the Taylor and Welch duo shot down at least 6 planes and managed to land safely. A second wave of Japanese attackers, comprising of 171 planes, was noticeably less effective. They were met by intense anti-aircraft fire and their target selection was faulty. They were instructed to target cruisers, but dropped their ordnance and mostly missed against other vessels. The battleship Nevada, whose crew was alert and reacted quickly, made a tempting target as it was underway and steaming toward the channel entrance. But the 15 or so attacking Val dive bombers should have known their bombs were ill-suited to sink a heavily armored battleship. They did score 5 hits. However, the ship wisely beached itself away from the entrance, thus defeating the entire purpose of the attack. All the second wave managed to do against their primary targets was a single bomb on the Raleigh. 4 modern cruisers were tied up and completely immobilized at the naval yard, but not a single bomb found this mark. Identifying ships in a combat situation is difficult. However, these Japanese pilots were the most vigorously trained in the world, and that they achieved only about a 20% hit rate versus stationary targets is hard to comprehend. I don't tend to put much stock into platitudes about American or any other country's alleged spirit and determination, but the facts do suggest that while the U.S. senior leadership was hesitant at Pearl Harbor, the sailors, crewmen, and people on the ground reacted quickly and correctly. Over 250,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition and thousands of 5-inch anti-aircraft shells were fired in just 90 minutes. It also should be noted that the destroyers Ward and Monahan were attentive enough to spot and sink Japanese submarines, rendering them so ineffective that they were relegated to a historical footnote. It seems probable that the second wave was blunted by an alert and active defense, which makes the whole attack that much more tragic, because if the Japanese first wave had not achieved surprise, a lot of ships and sailors would not have been lost. In total, 2,403 Americans were killed and 1,143 were wounded. A quick note here that puts into perspective just how dangerous serving in the Navy is. Generally, in World War II Army battles, the ratio of dead to wounded was about 1 to 3, thus 3 wounded for every killed in action. Look at those Pearl casualties again, more than double the amount killed than wounded. When naval vessels are almost instantly destroyed, as in the case of the Arizona, the loss of life is catastrophic. Consider also the pride of the British Royal Navy. The HMS Hood exploded and sank after a spectacular explosion caused by a single German shell that penetrated its magazine. Of a crew of 1,421 men, only 3 survived. When assessing the impact of Pearl Harbor, what is most important is what was not attacked. The U.S. aircraft carriers were not in port. While the damage suffered by the U.S. battle fleet was heavy, it was not crippling. Battleships Arizona and Oklahoma and the training ship Utah were the only permanent losses. Even though California, West Virginia, and Nevada were technically sunk, they were readily salvageable as they were resting in shallow water at a fully serviceable naval base. For example, the Nevada was part of the D-Day invasion of Hitler's Europe and served as a U.S. flagship. Indeed, every other ship hit during the attack was eventually returned to service. Even ships that were initially thought to be a total loss. The destroyer Shaw, for instance, a small warship not designed to take punishment, was hit by 3 bombs and suffered a tremendous explosion. Yet just 6 months later, in June 1942, the Shaw rejoined the fleet and went on to earn 11 battle stars. The Cassin Downs, pictured here, look like wrecks, but their machinery and equipment were salvaged, and with refitted hulls, the ships were eventually reserviced. The amount of accomplished engineers, mechanics, welders, and the collective technical skill possessed by the United States was staggering, and is just an example of how no country on earth was better prepared to fight a total war in which a nation's entire society is mobilized. It was not the old, slow battleships that represented the greatest military threat to Japan, although this was not known at the time. The U.S. carriers became the primary weapons in the Pacific, mostly because the U.S. Navy was forced to rely on them after Pearl Harbor. More significantly was that because the Japanese did not bother attacking the oil storage tanks, port facilities, and maintenance shops, the moment the Japanese planes departed, Pearl Harbor was fully functional as an advanced base that the Navy could project power from, which would happen with devastating effect just 6 months later at Midway. Consider, there would have been little chance for the U.S. to marshal in time the arrival of its carrier force at Midway without being seen or detected by the Japanese operating from San Diego, to say nothing of repairing the Yorktown. So although the Japanese had lost only 29 planes in the attack and achieved their primary objective of neutralizing the U.S. battleships, their victory was ephemeral and tactical, which basically means the United States was quickly able to contest Japanese grand strategy in the Pacific. By way of comparison, the British November 1940 attack on the Italian port of Taranto suggests the Japanese strike was not nearly as devastating as it could have been. Just 21 biplanes from a single British carrier attacked at night versus an active and prepared belligerent and managed to sink 1 battleship and heavily damage 2 others. The Japanese 353 modern aircraft from 6 carriers achieving surprise on a Sunday morning versus an unprepared neutral sunk 2 battleships and heavily damaged 3 others. The attack could have been much worse. Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo is best known for 2 critical mistakes in his career: not following up the Pearl Harbor attack and his indecision at Midway, which left his carriers vulnerable to the U.S. dive bombers that destroyed them. He was a cautious commander and not suited for the bold Pearl Harbor operation. Yet in this respect, I would hold the Japanese High Command responsible for the missed opportunities on December 7th. It is obvious that the Japanese did not regard the base facilities at Pearl as a high priority target, since the pilots in the first 2 waves were told to attack U.S. warships. Nagumo was instructed to neutralize the U.S. fleet, and having accomplished his appointed goal, his cautious nature led him to withdraw. Yamamoto later criticized Nagumo's decision as a grave error. Perhaps. Yet being a successful military commander is more than just drawing up strategy. It's about knowing your subordinates. If Yamamoto believed before December 7th that an aggressive follow-up to the initial attack might be necessary, then either his orders should have emphasized this, or a suitably aggressive commander such as Taemon Yamaguchi should have been appointed. More to the point, the entire Japanese premise for attack and opting for war with the United States was deeply flawed. They had hoped, and again, that's the correct term here, as it wasn't reasoned or calculated or assessed with hard data, that the United States would be so dispirited after a stinging blow that it would negotiate a compromised peace rather than endure a prolonged arduous fight. Hence, their priorities of targeting warships, which were more threatening in the short term. The experience of U.S. sailor Peter Tomich, one of the 2,403 killed that day, shows how deeply mistaken the Japanese beliefs regarding the supposed American aversion for sacrifice was. Tomich, born in 1893 in Bosnia, immigrated to the United States and served in the Navy since 1919. He had no family, no relatives. The Navy was his life. His crew was his family. On December 7th, he was the chief water tender on board the USS Utah, responsible for the maintenance and safety of the boilers that powered the ship. When 2 torpedoes hit the Utah, the ship began to list and an evacuation order was given so to get the crew off before the ship rolled over and sank. Tomich ignored the order. He could feel the ship turning over and knew unless the boilers were secured and attended, there could be a devastating explosion. "Get out," he screamed. "Go topside. The ship is turning over. You have to escape now." So as the crew scrambled to get off the doomed ship, Tomich stood at his post, moved from valve to valve, stabilizing the boilers and ensuring the ship would not explode before his crew, his family, could swim to safety. He must have known the ship's list meant his own window for escape would be impossible. Yet he willingly gave his life so that hundreds could live. The Utah's rusting hulk still lies at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. It's a war grave. For his actions, Tomich was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He represented the best in the tradition of the Navy, and his actions epitomized U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech when he stated,
"But always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory."
Exactly what Roosevelt said. It galvanized a population that previously did not want to get involved in the war. The U.S. entry into World War II was not inevitable. What the Japanese attack did was irrevocably change the contours of the Second World War. On December 6th, it was 2 distinctive and unrelated conflicts happening on 2 separate continents. That all changed. Churchill retrospectively put it best when he wrote in 1950, "At that very moment, I knew the United States was in the war, up to the neck and into the death. So we had won after all. How long the war would last, or in what fashion it would end, no man could tell, nor did I at that moment care. Hitler's fate was sealed. Mussolini's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. All the rest was merely the proper application of overwhelming force." The Second World War was a war of production, resources, manpower, and economic might. No nation on earth was comparable to the United States. By itself, it accounted for about half of the planet's war production during World War II. A modern military needs oil. Germany and Japan had none. The wells in places like Texas, Oklahoma, and California produced 6 billion barrels of the 7 billion the Allies would use. In a ridiculous display of its total war capabilities, the United States was not limited to fighting on a single front, did not have to choose between land, sea, or air, or even have to worry about expenses in its nuclear weapons program. The proverbial sleeping giant had awakened. This metaphor derives from an oft-quoted remark attributed to Yamamoto. first shown in the excellent film Tora, 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 which still, 50 years later, is the definitive motion picture of Pearl Harbor. At the movie's conclusion, when all the other Japanese officers are celebrating after hearing the battle reports, Yamamoto solemnly recognizes the gravity of the situation when he learns the attack happened before a declaration of war was given. He asserted, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Now, there is no evidence he ever uttered or wrote that remark. So should we act like a snobbish historian and just declare it a myth? No. I'm willing to bet the majority of quotes that we accept as true, especially those made before mass literacy and bureaucratic record keeping, were never actually said. We accept them because they nevertheless do accurately represent the significance or overall embodiment of the historical person. Louis XIV never said, "I am the state," but because the quote characterizes the grandeur of the Sun King in Versailles, and we can realistically imagine him saying it, there is historical value to it. Yamamoto was one of the few high-ranking military officers in Japan who cautioned against the war with the United States. He had studied at Harvard, learned to speak English as a naval attaché in Washington, and paid more attention to the chasm between American and Japanese industrial output than his peers. We do have evidence of Yamamoto warning about Japan's prospects in a long-term war with the United States. The most well-known is a 1940 remark quoted in Ronald Spector's Eagle Against the Sun. In the first 6 to 12 months of war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. These words were prophetic. The Japanese did run wild until the U.S. naval victory at Midway in June 1942.